Okay, well, thank you very much for coming, Sunera.
Thanks.
Today, we're on behalf of the organizing committee of the Human Condition Series, welcome you to our small little town, small little campus. We're so delighted to have you, including everyone else in this room. I'll start with a brief question regarding your latest work, Exalted Subjects. In it, in one of the chapters on nationality, you briefly allude to the Hegelian dialectic of history in relation to the imperial worldview. And I was wondering how much philosophical responsibility or irresponsibility in this case can we attribute to the so-called Enlightenment philosophers for laying the groundwork of a civilizational worldview that has helped facilitate legitimate contemporary global imperial order. So if you can elaborate on that.
How much responsibility we can lay at their feet? I think a great deal of responsibility, but again, whether it's a conscious project in terms of, but let me backtrack before I say that. My work is really about critical race theory. And it's really looking at Canadian nation formation through the lens of critical race theory, critical race and feminist theory. So certainly, I mean, race was a huge blind spot for these philosophers. But was it really a blind spot? Because of course, it's not that Hegel isn't aware of the rest of the world or doesn't refer to the rest of the world. So I guess the question is, it's a sort of historical responsibility, which I think you can certainly lay at their feet. But in terms of how actively and how consciously they're involved in this project, how much of it is just part of the taken for granted kind of location that they have? How much is the taken for granted kind of, knowledge production that they're involved in? How many of their assumptions they're just not questioning at all? I don't know how to answer that question, because is that a kind of conscious project? I don't know. And I think it differs on particular philosophers. But certainly it's, and for me, that's why critical race theory is so important for me, because it really talks to the kind of structural, systemic level of these processes of knowledge production. And sometimes the kind of human intention, motivation, desire is there. And at other times, it's much more kind of submerged, I guess. So I don't know if that satisfies you or not, but that's a difficult kind of question. And I think if you're looking at particular philosophers, you would have a kind of different, you would attribute them with kind of different levels of responsibility. But for me, that's, I mean, it's very clear that race is a very big blind spot at the same time as they are really kind of producing knowledge, which is extremely racialized. So, how much, it's a question that I think I struggle with today as well, when I look at the politics of race. And, you have people who are well-meaning, who you would not, who, even I would not say were kind of consciously and overtly involved in a kind of process of furthering their racial interests. But it's the taken for grantedness about their location, about the knowledge that they work with, the knowledge they produce. And how much responsibility you attribute, I guess, is a very difficult question for me to talk about in a very general way.
It's a very broad question.
So if there are particular kinds of instances, particular philosophers, you can give a kind of a more specific answer.
To this theme later and see how.
So basically, what you're saying though is that there's a normalizing element to the idea of white supremacy and whiteness.
Yes.
But then I'm also thinking of Goldberg's racist culture, which goes through this horrendous list of Western philosophers that are quite blatant in what it is that they're saying.
Yes.
Which always, I was, the first time I ever read that, I was quite shocked actually.
Yeah.
Well, my question has to do with the concept of. Oh, sorry. Did you want to respond to that?
Yes, no, I think you can find the sort of blatant racisms there in there, but I think you have to be very specific, kind of, who you are discussing, which particular works you're discussing. You know, I want to get to, I guess my work is really at getting to the place that's not so blatant, right? I mean, calling yourself a Canadian, right? A Canadian, what does that mean? That is not blatant racism to say I'm a proud Canadian. I am, you know, Canadians are law-abiding. Canadians are compassionate. Canadians are humanitarian, right? I mean, those are not racist statements, but they're deeply racialized claims, right? So I guess that's the level at which my work is really directed, is that, you know, the overt racism is, in a way, easier to deal with. You can name it, it's there, you can point out, okay, you use the word this here, right? You can do that. But it's the kind of, it's the non-blatant level of it. It's the very deep level at which racialization works, so that, for example, saying Canadians are humanitarian is not considered to be a racist or a racialized statement. Yet in the context of Canadian nation building, it's an incredibly racialized kind of claim, right? So I guess that's the level at which at which I approach the book.
Well, based on that, then, do you find, in terms of your method, do you find that really a genealogy then really becomes the best way to sort of try to work through that?
Yes, I think so. I think so. But, you know, as I say in my conclusion, this is not actually a genealogy. It's not. But yes, that's one method that could be, I think, very useful in getting at the kinds of questions that I'm asking around Canadian nation building.
Should I?
Go ahead.
Well, I just wanted to ask an idea around the concept of citizenship.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, you talk about what we were just talking about, the racialization of this concept of citizenship. Do you think then at sort of a deeper level, the concept of citizenship is sort of always already embedded within a Eurocentric white supremacist epistemology? And if so, does that mean that it's something that maybe we should abandon?
Well, I guess that is one of the really difficult questions for me. In the Canadian context, there's no question in my mind that Canadian citizenship is founded in the dispossession and the colonization of Aboriginal peoples. It is an institution that is deeply structuring white supremacy. Because for 100 years or more, people of color did not have access to citizenship. So it is an institution that is deeply steeped in colonialism, in white supremacy. And even when people of color have managed to gain some access to citizenship, it still is a very tenuous kind of access to citizenship, if we look at what is happening to Muslim Canadians, for example. So for me, citizenship, I mean, there's no doubt in my mind, theoretically, it's deeply steeped in white supremacy, in colonialism, in the dispossession of Aboriginal peoples. But I'm also an immigrant, and I know how important citizenship has been and continues to be for immigrants, for migrants, for women too, full access to citizenship. But you know, one of the and that's the dilemma that I really kind of faced when I was working on the chapter on citizenship. That yes, you have people of color, South Asians, Chinese, Canadians had to fight for access to citizenship, but they acquire access to citizenship in a way that makes them completely complicitous in the ongoing colonization and dispossession of Aboriginal peoples. And yet I understand what it means to have access to citizenship rights and entitlements. So I think it is an institution that remains, in the Canadian context, very deeply steeped in the kinds of racial oppressions and hierarchies that I'm talking about. So at the present, I would say yes to the kind of question you posed me. Yes, it is deeply entrenched in colonial and racialized relations of power. How we work beyond that, how we go beyond that, and what responsibility, from my perspective, people of color have in not kind of colluding in those kinds of relations is a very big, not just an intellectual project, but a very big political project for me as well. how you struggle for access to citizenship in the same moment that you're thinking of it in some kind of transformative way.
Yeah, especially given that,
Yeah.
that you're already in a society that's highly racialized.
That's right. Yeah.
As well, yeah.
I'd like to go on a slight, not too big of a tangent from what I heard you discussing with both
Okay.
of my colleagues. You've been, I won't say part of the feminist, but part of the women's movement for several
Yes.
years.
Yes.
And I also heard you talking about dispossession and the creation of identity.
Yes.
Now, whenever anyone creates any identity, don't they dispossess something to become something else?
Whenever anybody, well, yes, there is an element of exclusion, there is. But when I'm talking about the dispossession of Aboriginal peoples, I'm talking about a far more kind of profound and deeper level of dispossession that continues to happen.
In what way? Because
so-
my feeling is, and correct me if I'm wrong, that
Mm.
dispossession is a sphere, it's not a straight line. There's dispossession here and there both. Whereas on the one level, as you say, the Aboriginal natives are being dispossessed.
Mm.
On the other hand, are they also not consciously or unconsciously dispossessing themselves of their identity?
No, I think they've kind of historically fought to maintain their identity. And their identity is in a way that is not true, I think, of any other group of people that lives in Canada, that their identity is very closely tied to the land and to the territory. So I think that their identity, in terms of them also being exclusionary, I think that's you're taking away the element of power. Right?
No.
When you kind of, treat all identities as being the same and all of them being exclusionary or dispossessing others in the process, you're taking away the question of power.
No,
Right,
in fact,
so-
if you don't have the power to exclude, how do you create yourself?
Well, I think that for Aboriginal peoples, first of all, the identity that has been imposed on them by the Canadian state, and my work is very much also focused on the state and its role in how identities get produced and claimed, and in the case of Aboriginal peoples, imposed on them, right? So in the first instance, you have the very category that's used to refer to them and that's used to govern them, Indians, the Indian Act, right? This is an identity that has been imposed on them by the state, right? And so, when they then struggle to maintain their identity as Mohawks, Crees, whatever, to then say that that is also an exclusionary process is really to take out the element of power from your understanding of the situation. So I would not agree that when Aboriginal people are struggling to assert their particular identity, and yes, they have to do it in a way that is exclusionary, but I would not equate that with the way in which Canadians defend their identity with the power of the state backing them up.
Well, what's
I
the
would not
difference?
equate
I'm not saying there isn't
power,
a difference, but
Power is the difference.
Yes.
Power is the difference, right? Yeah.
I'd like to ask my question because it's very much related. Interestingly, about this conference, we've welcomed how many people have come from other parts of the world, but we haven't talked about those people who were not allowed to visit us. And they were invited to visit us. They wanted to be our guests. And what prevented them from coming was the Canadian state that did not issue them visas. And where were these people from? Kontin Trinya from Nigeria, Raja Riaz from Pakistan. And I don't have to, I think you
Yes.
could probably
Oh, yes,
guess
yes.
exactly
Yeah.
which countries we're talking about. So two questions related to one another. The master race, the exalted subject, is it white Anglo-Saxon Protestant? Is it privileged, wealthy? Is there is there a master race trying to the exalted subject that is global, or is it just in white, westernized, industrialized countries? And answering that question, how does the Canadian state maintain and allow that master race or exalted subject to continue?
Okay, in the case of Canada, and that's really what my book is about, I'm not looking at it anywhere else. So in the case of Canada, certainly the exalted subject is those who have had access and who can claim Canadianness, the Canadian identity, without being contested, right? And historically, that's been the British and French, right? which then subsequently also, I think, expanded to include immigrants of other European backgrounds. And certainly their access to the category Canadian, to the identity Canadian, continues to remain uncontested. In terms of how that plays out when we look at class, gender, because certainly within the nation we have all of these divisions as well, very deeply embedded divisions. But the argument I make is that in their claim to nationality, oppressed classes, genders can still claim proximity to the elite through having access to nationality, granted not the same level of access. How does the state continue to uphold that today? To me, it's really through multiculturalism as official state policy, and then through the definition of the British and French as the two founding nations. And we continue to live in Canada with this concept of two founding nations, and they are the British and French. Canada continues to be defined as bilingual and bicultural, that is English and French. And then multiculturalism becomes the way in which ethnic and racial identities get negotiated. And so that becomes the terrain on which you can claim access to nationality. Very restricted, but always contested, and only under certain kinds of conditions. So that's the kind of process that I'm describing in my book. And in terms of state policies, I'm very clear in the book about what state policies actually inscribe these identities, create the particular content of that nationality through compassionate and caring. I look at the policies of the welfare state, the social policies of the welfare state, and look at how that identity gets inscribed and a subject position gets created, which can be claimed by particular subjects, exalted subjects. And I'll give you very small examples of how that happens in everyday life. I have a daughter. When I take her to get registered in a school, we moved quite a few times. Every time the question would be, "Where's your passport?" Right? And yet, white neighbors didn't have to go through the same process. And it's at that level that these identities and these kinds of, accesses to nationality are lived out. So, I'm very clear in my book about which state policies I think contribute, or the ways in which they actually construct these particularly exalted subject positions, which are then available to some and not to others.
Actually, my question probably will continue from Mary Ann's is, in a piece that you wrote after the famous speech, or for some people the infamous
speech,
you gave an address in Ottawa
Yes.
on a conference on violence against women.
Yes.
And you explained yourself in that
Yes,
article.
I did.
And what you did is you answered your critics.
Yes.
By the way, actually, I had read Arundhati Roy, and I had read also a great, very interesting Pakistani philosopher, professor of philosophy, Milian Musharraf. And just about a matter of days before you gave your speech, they said exactly the same thing.
Right.
The difference was you used passionate language.
Yes.
Then in this piece, you you answered your critics, and you refused to take back the language. Even not just your critics, a lot of your supporters told her, unfortunately, she used language like
That's
blood
right.
soaked and stuff. And you spoke about embodied discourses.
Yes.
Right. And you refused to take back that language, I think,
Yes.
correctly, because you said in the kind of discourses circulated, especially about American foreign policy, they basically just conceal, camouflage what is actually going on, what these discourses actually inscribe upon the body.
Yes.
You actually are very close to the tradition of genealogy. It was Nietzsche in the genealogy who put it best, that history is inscribed upon the body.
Okay.
There is a great tradition which links up with the one you identify
Okay.
in your piece. I was wondering if you can just go through the notion of exalted subjects and I guess explain or elaborate further how embodying discourses is so important to understanding the notion of exalted subjects.
Well, I think these discourses are, as you say, they are embodied. And, when I kind of faced my critics about the language I had used,
Yes.
that it was passionate and offensive. And yes, I mean, I was passionate. I was passionate about trying to, you know, work with the movement,
I
stopping the
actually,
war.
I was teaching at Concordia at the time. I checked the responses on the net. I was teaching a class at the time.
Yes.
We were doing this class of civilizations, and then September 11th occurred. And I remember having to explain to my students why I thought this debate was relevant, for even as pernicious as it was. And then 2 days later, I didn't have to explain that anymore. People were knocking at the door. And I was going to ask again about the embodiment of discourses, or how discourses are embodied.
Right, yeah.
Oh yeah, that's it. And Musharraf and Arundhati Roy did not receive anywhere near the kind of response, vitriolic responses that you received.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Do you think that's only because you were speaking in Canada and they weren't? Roy was in India at the time, and Musharraf, she was teaching in Pakistan.
I think that I was speaking in Canada, but I was speaking as an immigrant who refused to play the role of the supplicant, right?
Yes.
Immigrants can speak as long as we are grateful to the nation, as long as we are appropriately, deferential to Canadian kindnesses. I was speaking as an immigrant who was actually articulating a different discourse, if you will,
Yeah, sure.
right?
Mhm.
So I think the kind of the vehemence of the response, I think, was very much tied to how dare you. And it's for immigrants, we're tolerated in this society as long as we agree to, you know, be the supplicant. Once you step out of that role, and it happened to me once before as well, when I became the president of NAC.
I see.
And at that time, I was accused of being an illegal immigrant. That was the accusation, that I was an illegal immigrant. So as soon as you step outside that supplicant role, that's when you kind of feel the full
You
full
You were also the
force.
subject of an RCMP.
Yes, I was the subject of an RCMP hate crime investigation, which it took me 3 years to actually fight.
That's what actually at the time struck me, is that
Yes,
I
yes.
saw the reaction, and I had already used Roy
Yes.
and Musharraf's work in one of my classes.
Yeah,
so
yeah, no,
completely different.
that's right. And what people don't know is it took me 3 years to fight that, and there never was an apology from the RCMP. So that's embodied discourse for you,
Yes,
which body
exactly.
speaks and articulates what kinds of experiences and perspectives, and then the repercussions of that.
Yeah.
But I have not read Nietzsche, so I am not going to.
Yeah, Foucault actually.
Yeah, but
took
I
a direction after.
yeah.
Yes, Sunera, in your work, you're dealing with many authors and theorists.
Yes, too many.
Too many. No, but it's good. It integrates all the theoretical discourses pertains to all these issues that you're exploring and interested
Yes.
in. And one of the texts is Hardy Negri's text.
Yes.
The most popular text ever since September 11th that everyone has read and had to read. And there are certain concepts and discourses that you've been dealing with in this text. And there's a line where you criticize their work for, and specifically their work Empire, where you argue that they do not take the racial dimension within the context of empire and the imperial project into consideration as an important dimension
Yes.
of this project, this new American Century project. But then you depart from it. I was wondering if you can elaborate on that, their work in relation to how you see their work.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I'm really, I think I do that in the last chapter where I'm
Yeah.
talking about the war on terror. So,
Yes.
I do think that, I'm writing after the fact, and, clearly they wrote the book before 9/11 and the events
Yes.
of 9/11. But it seemed to me that their analysis was completely silent on questions of gender and race, and 9/11 showed very, very clearly the importance of both race and gender in a way that was obvious to some of us before, But after 9/11, it became obvious to everybody, and we've seen very clearly the use of gender. Gender has become kind of a key part of the ideological battle, if you will, around.
Especially in the context of